Case 1. China Arnold. The microwave murder that horrified the nation. On a sweltering summer night in August of 2005, in a modest apartment in Dayton, Ohio, something happened that would forever change how we view the depths of human cruelty. 26-year-old China Arnold had just returned home from a night out at a local bar with her boyfriend, Terrell Talley. The couple had been drinking, and an argument erupted between them. An argument about the paternity of Arnold's 1-month-old daughter, Paris Talley. What happened next would become one of the most horrifying cases of child murder in American history. According to court documents and testimony presented at trial, China Arnold, in a fit of rage and under the influence of alcohol, took her tiny infant daughter and placed her inside a microwave oven. The baby, just 4 weeks old, weighing barely more than 10 pounds, was placed inside the kitchen appliance. Arnold then turned on the microwave. The details of what Paris endured in those final moments are almost too painful to comprehend. When Arnold's 7-year-old son discovered his baby sister the next morning, Paris was already deceased. The child ran to wake his mother, who then called 911. When paramedics arrived at the apartment on North Wyoming Street, they found the infant with burns so severe that they initially couldn't determine what had caused them. Paris had high-temperature burns on her body, and her internal organs showed signs of being cooked from the inside out. The Dayton Police Department immediately launched an investigation. Initially, Arnold claimed she had no idea what happened to her daughter. She told investigators she had put Paris to bed the night before and found her unresponsive in the morning. But the medical evidence told a different story. The Montgomery County Coroner's Office determined that Paris had died from hyperthermia. Essentially, she had been cooked to death. The burn patterns and internal injuries were consistent with microwave radiation. As detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies in Arnold's story began to emerge. Neighbors reported hearing a baby crying in the middle of the night. Arnold's older son, who witnessed more than any child should ever have to see, provided investigators with crucial information. The boyfriend, Terrell Talley, initially became a suspect, but evidence increasingly pointed toward Arnold herself. The investigation revealed a troubling pattern in Arnold's life. She had struggled with alcohol abuse and had a volatile relationship with Talley. On the night of Paris's death, the couple had been arguing about whether Talley was actually the father of the baby. In a drunken rage, prosecutors would later argue, Arnold decided to take out her anger on the most vulnerable victim imaginable, her own infant daughter. China Arnold was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. The case would become a media sensation, drawing national and international attention. How could a mother do such a thing? What kind of rage or mental state would lead someone to commit such an act? These questions dominated headlines for months. The legal proceedings were complex and drawn out. Arnold's first trial in 2008 ended in a conviction, and she was sentenced to death. However, the Ohio Supreme Court overturned that conviction in 2010 due to procedural errors. A second trial was ordered. In 2011, Arnold was again convicted of aggravated murder. This time, the jury recommended a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole rather than death. During the sentencing hearing, the prosecution presented evidence that painted a picture of a woman who had shown no remorse for her actions. There were no tears, no apologies, no acknowledgement of the horror she had inflicted on her own child. The judge, in handing down the sentence, called the crime unconscionable and stated that Arnold would never be free to harm another child. Paris Talley's short life ended in unimaginable agony. She never got to take her first steps, speak her first words, or experience any of the joys of childhood. Her father, Terrell Talley, was left to mourn a daughter he barely got to know. The community of Dayton was left shocked and traumatized by a crime that seemed to defy all human understanding. Today, China Arnold remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, Ohio. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars, a punishment that many believe is still too lenient for the crime she committed. The microwave that was used as a murder weapon became a symbol of how everyday objects can become instruments of horror in the wrong hands. The case prompted discussions nationwide about child protection, domestic violence, and the warning signs that might prevent such tragedies in the future. The Dayton Police Department's investigation into this case was exhaustive. Detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses, examined every piece of physical evidence, and worked tirelessly to ensure justice for Paris. The medical examiner's report was particularly detailed, documenting every injury the baby suffered. These reports are difficult to read, filled with technical medical terminology that describes the systematic destruction of a tiny human body. Arnold's defense attorneys argued that she was too intoxicated to form the intent necessary for murder, that perhaps Terrell Talley was responsible, or that the death might have been an accident. But the jury didn't buy it. The evidence was too overwhelming, the injuries too specific, and the circumstances too damning. The prosecution successfully argued that Arnold knew exactly what she was doing when she placed Paris in that microwave and turned it on. In the years since her conviction, Arnold has maintained her innocence, claiming that someone else must have killed Paris. She's filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. The courts have consistently upheld her conviction and sentence, finding no merit in her claims of innocence or procedural errors. The Paris Talley case remains one of the most disturbing child murder cases in Ohio history. It's studied in criminal justice courses as an example of extreme parental abuse. Child protection agencies have used it as a teaching tool about the dangers of substance abuse combined with unstable home environments. For the people of Dayton, particularly those who lived in Arnold's neighborhood, the case left psychological scars that persist to this day. If you're as shocked by this case as we were researching it, don't forget to like this video. We bring you the most in-depth coverage of true crime cases, always with respect for the victims and dedication to the facts. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Case 2. Nicole Dyer, the house fire that couldn't hide the truth. In the quiet suburban community of Lorain County, Ohio, in the spring of 2003, a house fire drew the attention of local firefighters. These brave first responders rushed to the scene expecting to battle a typical residential blaze, perhaps caused by faulty wiring or an unattended stove. What they discovered instead was a crime scene so disturbing that it would haunt them for years to come. Inside the burned-out shell of the home, firefighters found the body of 4-year-old Jacob Dyer. The boy had perished in the flames, but as investigators from the Lorain County Sheriff's Office began sifting through the evidence, troubling questions emerged. The fire patterns didn't match an accidental blaze. The location of Jacob's body seemed unusual, and perhaps most suspicious of all, the boy's mother, Nicole Dyer, seemed strangely detached from the tragedy that had just claimed her son's life. Nicole Dyer was a 31-year-old single mother who, by all outward appearances, had been struggling with the responsibilities of parenthood. Neighbors later told investigators that they had concerns about Jacob's welfare in the months leading up to his death. The boy appeared thin, withdrawn, and often seemed fearful around his mother. But like so many cases of child abuse, these warning signs went unreported, and Jacob paid the ultimate price. As fire investigators processed the scene, they discovered evidence of accelerants, substances used to start and spread fires deliberately. The patterns of burning suggested multiple points of origin, a hallmark of arson. But it was the medical examiner's findings that would transform this from an arson investigation into a homicide case. When the coroner examined Jacob's remains, despite the extensive damage caused by the fire, certain findings stood out. There was evidence of smoke inhalation, which would be expected in a fire death. But there were also indicators that suggested Jacob might have already been deceased or unconscious before the fire started. The positioning of the body, certain injury patterns, and other forensic evidence pointed toward a disturbing conclusion. Jacob had been killed, and then the house had been set on fire to cover up the crime. Detectives interviewed Nicole Dyer extensively. Her story was inconsistent from the start. She claimed she had been out of the house when the fire started, that she returned to find her home engulfed in flames. But witnesses contradicted her timeline. Neighbors reported seeing her car in the driveway during the time she claimed to be elsewhere. Store surveillance footage didn't match her alibi. With each interview, the holes in her story grew larger. Under mounting pressure and faced with overwhelming evidence, investigators began to piece together what really happened that day. According to the prosecution's theory, which would later be presented at trial, Nicole Dyer had suffocated her son Jacob. The exact method was difficult to determine due to the fire damage, but evidence suggested the child had been deprived of oxygen until he died. After killing her son, Dyer had set her house on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence, and make the death appear accidental. But why? What could possibly motivate a mother to kill her own child? As investigators dug into Dyar's background, a picture emerged of a woman overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood, struggling with mental health issues, and possibly suffering from severe depression. Friends and family members described her as increasingly isolated and erratic in the months before Jacob's death. Some suggested she had expressed feelings of being trapped by motherhood, of wanting to be free from the burden of caring for a young child. Nicole Dyar was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, involuntary manslaughter, aggravated arson, and abuse of a corpse. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that the murder was premeditated and that the attempt to cover it up by burning the house showed consciousness of guilt and a cold, calculating mind. The trial was emotionally charged. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and expert opinions that painted a damning picture of Nicole Dyar as a mother who had chosen to end her child's life rather than continue caring for him. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the fire damage made it impossible to determine definitively how Jacob died, and that the prosecution's theory was based on speculation rather than hard facts. The jury didn't see it that way. After deliberating for several days, they returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts, including aggravated murder. In the penalty phase of the trial, the same jury recommended death. The judge agreed, sentencing Nicole Dyar to death by lethal injection. Jacob Dyar's short life had been filled with more pain and fear than any child should ever experience. In his final moments, the one person who should have protected him, his mother, had instead taken his life. The community of Lorain County mourned not just the loss of a child, but the loss of innocence, the shattering of the belief that mothers inherently protect their children. However, the story didn't end with that death sentence. Years later, after multiple appeals and legal challenges, Nicole Dyar's death sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Various factors contributed to this decision, including evolving legal standards around death penalty cases and issues with her original sentencing hearing. While some saw this as a victory for the anti-death penalty movement, others, particularly those who knew Jacob, viewed it as a miscarriage of justice. Today, Nicole Dyar remains behind bars at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She will never be released. She will never again walk as a free woman. She will spend every day for the rest of her life knowing that she took the life of her own son and then tried to burn away the evidence of her crime. The Jacob Dyar case had lasting impacts on Lorain County's approach to child welfare. Social services received increased funding for home visits and intervention programs. Teachers and school officials received additional training on recognizing signs of child abuse. Jacob's Law, a local ordinance, was proposed to strengthen reporting requirements for suspected child neglect. Fire investigators who worked the scene have spoken publicly about how the case changed their approach to residential fires involving children. They became more attuned to the possibility that not every fire is accidental, that some blazes are deliberately set to conceal even darker crimes. The case is now used in training programs for fire investigators across Ohio. The psychological profile of Nicole Dyar has been studied by forensic psychologists trying to understand maternal filicide, when mothers kill their children. While rare, such cases happen more often than most people realize. Understanding the warning signs, the risk factors, and the psychological states that can lead to such tragedies is crucial for prevention. Dyar's case checked many of the boxes: social isolation, lack of support system, possible mental health issues, and expressions of feeling overwhelmed by parenting responsibilities. For Jacob's extended family, the pain never goes away. They established a small memorial in his honor, and they speak his name so that he's remembered as more than just a victim of a horrifying crime. They remember his smile, his love of toy cars, his infectious laugh. They remember the little boy he was before his life was stolen by the one person who should have treasured it most. If this case has moved you, if you believe in justice for victims like Jacob Dyar, please take a moment to like this video. We're committed to telling these difficult stories with the depth and respect they deserve. Your support helps us continue this important work. Case 3. Gail Ritchie, the baby who became Geauga's child. On a cold December day in 1993, two hunters walking through a wooded area near Chardon, Ohio, in Geauga County, made a discovery that would haunt the community for over 2 decades. Partially buried in the frozen ground, wrapped in a plastic bag, they found the body of a newborn baby. The infant had been dead for some time, and the winter conditions had preserved the tiny body. The Geauga County Sheriff's Office immediately launched an investigation into what appeared to be an abandoned newborn. But without any identification, without any leads, without even a name, the case quickly went cold. The baby was buried in a local cemetery with a small headstone that read Geauga's Child, a name given by a community that refused to let this infant be forgotten, even if no one knew who she was. For 21 years, Geauga's Child remained an unsolved mystery. The case file stayed open, but with no DNA matches, no missing person reports that fit, and no witnesses coming forward, investigators had nowhere to turn. The baby's grave became a local landmark of sorts, a somber reminder of an unsolved tragedy. People would leave flowers and stuffed animals at the site, honoring the memory of a child who had been denied even the most basic right, the right to live. But cold cases have a way of warming up when new technology becomes available. In the early 2010s, advances in DNA testing and genealogical databases opened new possibilities for identifying unknown victims. Geauga County authorities decided to take another look at the decades-old case, extracting DNA from the preserved remains and running it through modern databases. The breakthrough came in 2015. Through genetic genealogy, the same technique that would later be used to catch the Golden State Killer and solve numerous other cold cases, investigators were able to identify a possible family connection. The DNA pointed them toward a woman named Gail Eastwood Ritchie, who had been living in the area in 1993. Detectives approached Ritchie, now in her 40s and living a seemingly normal life. What followed was a confession that stunned investigators. After more than 2 decades of silence, Gail Ritchie admitted to giving birth in secret in 1993 when she was just 18 years old. She had concealed her pregnancy from everyone, her family, her friends, even the baby's father. When she went into labor, she was alone. According to her confession, Ritchie gave birth in her home. The baby was born alive. But Ritchie, panicked and terrified about what would happen if anyone discovered her secret, made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She wrapped the newborn in plastic and drove to the wooded area near Chardon. There, she abandoned the baby, leaving the infant to die from exposure in the December cold. The question that everyone asked was, why? Why hide a pregnancy in the first place? Why not seek help? Why not leave the baby at a hospital or fire station where she would have been cared for? Ritchie's explanation painted a picture of a young woman overwhelmed by fear and shame. She came from a strict religious family where pregnancy outside of marriage was considered shameful. She was terrified of her parents' reaction, terrified of being ostracized by her community, terrified of the responsibility of motherhood. But fear doesn't justify murder. The prosecutors made that clear when Gail Ritchie was arrested and charged with murder, involuntary manslaughter, and gross abuse of a corpse. The fact that 21 years had passed didn't matter. There's no statute of limitations on murder in Ohio. The legal proceedings brought up complex questions about mental state, youth, and the circumstances of the crime. Ritchie's defense attorneys argued that she had been a frightened teenager, not a cold-blooded killer. They pointed to her clean record in the years since the incident, her stable life, her remorse. They argued for leniency, suggesting that she had already lived with the guilt for over 2 decades. The prosecution saw things differently. They argued that regardless of Ritchie's age at the time, she had made a series of conscious choices that resulted in an infant's death. She chose to hide her pregnancy. She chose not to seek medical help during labor. She chose to wrap a living baby in plastic. She chose to drive to a remote location. She chose to leave that baby in the woods to die. Each of these was a deliberate decision, not a momentary panic. In 2015, Gail Ritchie pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and gross abuse of a corpse. In exchange for her guilty plea and cooperation, the murder charge was dropped. The judge sentenced her to a significant prison term, life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 15 years. This meant that Ritchie wouldn't be eligible for parole until around 2030, when she would be in her mid-50s. The sentencing brought mixed reactions from the community. Some felt that justice had finally been served for Geauga's Child, that the baby's killer would spend years behind bars paying for her crime. Others felt that the sentence was too lenient given the deliberate nature of the abandonment, or too harsh given Ritchie's age at the time of the crime and her subsequent years of law-abiding behavior. What no one disputed was the tragedy of it all. A baby's life had been thrown away before it had even begun. A young woman's life had been destroyed by a series of terrible decisions made in fear and desperation. Two families, Ritchie's and the baby's fathers, were left to grapple with revelations that shattered their understanding of their own histories. After Ritchie's conviction, the baby was finally given a name. Though the infant's original name, the one Gail Ritchie might have given her had she lived, was never disclosed, the community continued to refer to her as Geauga's child, now a symbol not just of an unsolved mystery, but of a tragedy finally brought to light. The case prompted renewed discussion about safe haven laws that allow parents to anonymously surrender newborns at designated locations without fear of prosecution. Ohio's safe haven law, which had been enacted in 2000, came too late to save Geauga's child, but advocates hoped it would prevent future tragedies. These laws recognize that desperate parents sometimes need a way out, a way to ensure their child's safety, even if they feel unable to care for them. Gail Ritchie's case is also studied in discussions about neonaticide, the killing of a newborn within the first 24 hours of life. Research shows that neonaticide often involves young mothers, concealed pregnancies, and births that occur in secret. The psychological state of women who commit neonaticide is often characterized by denial, dissociation, and panic. Understanding these patterns is crucial for prevention. For the hunters who discovered Geauga's child back in 1993, the resolution of the case brought a measure of closure. They had never forgotten that day, and they were relieved that the baby's killer had finally been identified and held accountable. They attended the court proceedings, wanting to ensure that someone was there to represent the infant who couldn't speak for herself. Gail Ritchie remains incarcerated, serving her sentence and waiting for the day when she might be eligible for parole. Whether she'll actually be released when that day comes remains to be seen. Parole boards consider many factors, including remorse, rehabilitation, and the nature of the original crime. Given the deliberate nature of the baby's abandonment and the decades Ritchie spent living her life while Geauga's child lay in an unmarked grave, her path to freedom is uncertain. The grave that once bore only the words Geauga's child has become a place of reflection on the fragility of life, the importance of compassion, and the lasting impact of secrets kept. The community of Geauga County will never forget the baby in the woods, and they'll never forget the lesson her short life taught, that every life matters, every baby deserves protection, and some crimes echo across decades until justice finally catches up. This case reminds us of the importance of supporting vulnerable young women facing unplanned pregnancies. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. We're dedicated to bringing you thoroughly researched true crime content that honors victims and seeks justice. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. Case 4. Ming Ming Chun. A daughter's life ended in a family restaurant. The American dream drew Ming Ming Chun from China to the United States, where she hoped to build a better life for her family. She and her husband worked tirelessly, eventually opening a Chinese restaurant in Jackson Township, Stark County, Ohio. The restaurant represented years of sacrifice, long hours, and the hopes they had for their children's future. But behind the counter where customers ordered egg rolls and fried rice, a nightmare was unfolding. 5-year-old Ashley Zhao should have been in kindergarten, learning to read, making friends, experiencing the carefree joys of childhood. Instead, on January 19, 2017, Ashley was at the family restaurant, the Ang's Asian Cuisine, when her life came to a brutal end at the hands of her own mother. According to court documents and testimony that would later emerge during legal proceedings, Ming Ming Chun subjected her daughter to a horrific beating that day. The assault was so severe, so sustained, that it resulted in fatal injuries. When emergency responders arrived at the restaurant after receiving a 911 call, they found Ashley unresponsive. The little girl had sustained massive trauma, and despite the efforts of paramedics and emergency room doctors, she could not be saved. Ashley Zhao was pronounced dead. The Stark County Sheriff's Office immediately launched a homicide investigation. The medical examiner's report painted a horrific picture of the abuse Ashley had endured. She had multiple injuries in various stages of healing, indicating that the violence hadn't been a one-time incident. Ashley had been suffering for some time, her small body bearing the evidence of repeated assaults. The fatal injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma. She had been beaten to death. As investigators interviewed witnesses and family members, a disturbing pattern emerged. Ming Chun had an explosive temper, particularly when it came to Ashley. Neighbors and acquaintances reported hearing the sounds of disciplining that seemed excessive. School records, when they could be obtained, showed concerning patterns of absences. Ashley had been withdrawn from school at one point, officially for homeschooling, but investigators suspected it was to hide evidence of abuse. The cultural context added another layer of complexity to the case. Some in the community wondered whether Chin's understanding of discipline had been shaped by different cultural norms, whether she had brought practices from China that were incompatible with American standards of child welfare. But investigators and prosecutors were clear: there is no cultural context that justifies beating a 5-year-old child to death. This wasn't discipline. This was murder. Ming Chun was arrested and charged with murder. She initially claimed that Ashley had fallen, that the injuries were accidental. But the medical evidence contradicted this story. The pattern of injuries, their severity, and the forensic findings all pointed to deliberate, sustained violence. As the investigation continued, more evidence emerged of previous abuse, of a pattern of escalating violence that had finally resulted in Ashley's death. The case brought up difficult questions about mandatory reporting and the systems meant to protect children. Had teachers noticed signs of abuse before Ashley was withdrawn from school? Had anyone reported concerns to Child Protective Services? Were there opportunities to intervene that had been missed? These questions haunted the community and prompted soul-searching among those who worked with children. Ashley's father, Zhao Yumian, was also investigated. While he wasn't charged with directly causing Ashley's death, questions lingered about what he knew, what he witnessed, and why he hadn't protected his daughter. The dynamics within the Chunzhao household were complex, with cultural factors, language barriers, and family hierarchies all playing roles in the tragic isolation that allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. The legal proceedings moved forward with Ming Chun facing the possibility of spending decades in prison. Her defense attorneys faced an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming. The medical examiner's testimony was damning. And most heartbreaking of all, Ashley's own body told the story of prolonged suffering. In a surprising turn, rather than face trial, Ming Chun agreed to a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, child endangering, and permitting child abuse. The plea agreement spared her a murder conviction but still resulted in a substantial sentence. In September of 2017, she was sentenced to 22 years in prison. This meant she wouldn't be eligible for release until she was well into her 60s, having spent the majority of her remaining years behind bars. The sentencing hearing was emotional. Through translators, Chen expressed remorse for her actions, claiming that she had never meant to kill her daughter, that things had spiraled out of control. But for those who had seen the evidence, who knew the extent of Ashley's suffering, these words rang hollow. How do you accidentally beat a child to death? How do you inflict injury after injury without recognizing that you're killing your own daughter? Ashley Zhao's short life had been filled with pain. The little girl who should have been learning her ABCs had instead learned fear. The child who should have been playing with toys had instead been living in terror of her own mother. Her death sparked outrage in the Jackson Township community and beyond. How had this been allowed to happen? How had a 5-year-old child been beaten to death in a restaurant while the community went about its business just feet away? The Yang's Asian Cuisine restaurant closed shortly after Ashley's death. The building stood empty for a time, a reminder of the horror that had occurred there. Eventually, new owners took over the space, but for many in the community, the location would always be associated with Ashley Zhao and the tragedy that unfolded behind its doors. The case prompted changes in how Ohio handles child welfare cases involving immigrant families. Language barriers, cultural differences, and isolation can all contribute to situations where abuse goes undetected and unreported. Advocates pushed for more multilingual child welfare workers, for better outreach to immigrant communities, and for education about American standards for child safety and discipline that don't involve physical violence. Ming Ming Chen's case is studied in discussions about child abuse in the context of family businesses. When children are brought to work with their parents, who's watching out for their welfare? When families are isolated within their own small business, operating long hours with limited outside contact, abuse can flourish unchecked. Ashley's death highlighted the need for broader community vigilance and for systems that can identify at-risk children even when they're not regularly attending school. For those who knew Ashley, even briefly, the memories remain painful. Teachers who had worked with her remember a quiet, withdrawn child who seemed always on edge. Customers who had seen her in the restaurant remember a little girl who never smiled, who seemed fearful and subdued. These observations, which might have seemed like simple shyness at the time, now appeared as red flags that had been missed. Ming Ming Chun remains incarcerated in the Ohio prison system, serving her 22-year sentence. She has over a decade left before she might be released. Whether she'll be deported after serving her sentence remains to be seen. What's certain is that she'll never forget what she did, and the memory of Ashley Zhao will haunt not just her, but everyone who failed to save that little girl. Ashley's grave has become a place of remembrance, adorned with toys and flowers left by community members who never knew her in life, but who want to honor her memory in death. Her story serves as a stark reminder that child abuse happens in every community, in every cultural context, and that vigilance is everyone's responsibility. If Ashley's story has touched you, if you believe in protecting children and seeking justice for victims, please take a moment to like this video. We cover these difficult cases because they matter, because victims deserve to be remembered, and because awareness can prevent future tragedies. Case 5. Crystal Candelario, the vacation that left a toddler to die alone. In June of 2023, the Cleveland community was rocked by a case so callous, so devoid of basic human compassion, that it defied comprehension. Crystal Candelario, a 32-year-old mother, had decided she needed a vacation. She wanted to visit Puerto Rico, to enjoy the beaches, to relax, and have fun. There was just one problem: her 16-month-old daughter, Jalen Candelario. Rather than arrange childcare, rather than ask family or friends to watch her toddler, rather than take Jalen with her, Crystal Candelario made a decision that would shock the nation. She left her baby at home alone. And not for a few hours. Not even for a day. Crystal Candelario left her 16-month-old daughter alone in their Cleveland home for 10 days while she vacationed in Puerto Rico and Detroit. 10 days. 240 hours. 14,400 minutes. For every single one of those moments, little Jalen was alone. She was trapped in a playpen, unable to escape, unable to reach food or water, unable to call for help, unable to understand why her mother had abandoned her. The toddler, barely more than a baby, died slowly from starvation and severe dehydration in what can only be described as one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. When Crystal Candelario returned from her vacation on June 16, 2023, she found her daughter's lifeless body in the playpen where she had left her. Jalen had been dead for days. The apartment showed the evidence of the toddler's desperate final days: soiled bedding, signs that the child had suffered immensely before finally succumbing to the effects of having no food or water for over a week. Candelario called 911, and when Cleveland police officers and paramedics arrived, they were immediately struck by several things. The apartment was in disarray in a way that indicated Jalen had been alone for an extended period. The child's body showed obvious signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration. And perhaps most damning, Candelario's own demeanor was oddly detached, showing little emotion at the death of her daughter. As detectives began investigating, they quickly uncovered the truth. Crystal Candelario had deliberately left her daughter alone while she went on vacation. Phone records, social media posts, and financial records all painted a picture of a woman who had been enjoying herself, posting pictures from beaches, checking into hotels, making purchases, while her baby was dying alone at home. The Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office performed an autopsy on Jalen and determined that the cause of death was severe dehydration and starvation. The toddler's body showed the horrific effects of being deprived of food and water for over a week. She had lost a significant percentage of her body weight. Her organs had begun to shut down. The medical examiner's report described suffering that no human being, let alone a helpless toddler, should ever endure. As investigators dug deeper into Candelario's background, they discovered this wasn't the first time she had left Jalen alone. There was evidence of previous trips where the child had been left unattended for extended periods, though not as long as the fatal 10-day absence. Neighbors reported that they had sometimes heard Jalen crying for hours, but they hadn't realized the child was alone. The apartment building's security cameras showed Candelario leaving and returning at times when Jalen would have been by herself. The question that haunted everyone was, how could a mother do this? How could someone leave a baby alone, knowing what would happen? Psychologists and child welfare experts weighed in, trying to explain the inexplicable. Some suggested Candelario suffered from severe mental health issues or postpartum depression that had never been treated. Others pointed to possible substance abuse problems. Still others believed she was simply a narcissist who valued her own pleasure over her daughter's life. Crystal Candelario was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. The evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable. Her own phone, her social media accounts, her financial records, everything documented her vacation while Jalen died. Prosecutors sought the maximum penalty, arguing that this was one of the most egregious cases of child neglect resulting in death that they had ever encountered. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Candelario's defense attorneys advised her to accept a plea deal. In February of 2024, Crystal Candelario pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and child endangering charges. The plea deal spared her from facing a jury trial, but it didn't spare her from justice. At her sentencing hearing in March of 2024, the judge heard from family members, from investigators, and from child welfare advocates. They spoke about Jalen's short life, about the suffering she endured in her final days, about the absolute betrayal of the parent-child bond that Candelario had committed. The prosecution presented evidence of the extent of Jalen's suffering, painting a heartbreaking picture of a toddler crying out for a mother who wasn't there, who never came, who had chosen a vacation over her daughter's life. The judge's words at sentencing were scathing. He called Candelario's actions the ultimate betrayal and stated that she had shown a complete and total disregard for human life. He noted that Jalen's death had been slow, painful, and entirely preventable. He described the case as one of the worst examples of parental neglect he had encountered in his decades on the bench. Crystal Candelario was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will never be released. She will spend every remaining day of her life behind bars, thinking about the daughter she left to die while she was posting vacation photos on social media. The judge made clear that someone who could do what Candelario did could never be trusted in society again. The case drew national attention, with media outlets across the country covering the story. The details were so shocking that many people initially couldn't believe they were real. A mother leaving a baby alone for 10 days to go on vacation seemed like something out of a horror movie, not real life. But it was real, and Jalen Candelario paid for her mother's selfishness with her life. In the wake of Jalen's death, the Cleveland community grappled with questions about how such a tragedy could have been prevented. Were there signs that had been missed? Should neighbors have been more insistent when they heard a baby crying? Should apartment management have investigated? Should there be more frequent welfare checks on young children? Child welfare agencies examined their procedures, looking for gaps that might allow a case like Jalen's to slip through the cracks. The reality was sobering. Unless someone reports concerns about a child's welfare, unless there's some interaction with systems like schools or healthcare providers, a child can be invisible to protective services. Jalen had been seen by a pediatrician at her regular checkups, but she wasn't old enough for daycare or school, and her mother hadn't raised red flags during those medical visits. The case also sparked discussions about the isolation of modern parenting, particularly for single mothers. While Candelario's actions were inexcusable and criminal, child welfare experts noted that better support systems for parents, more accessible childcare, and stronger community connections might help prevent future tragedies. When parents feel overwhelmed, isolated, or unable to cope, there need to be resources available before they make irreversible decisions. Jalen Candelario's life was short, but should not be forgotten. She was a toddler who loved to play, who was just learning to walk and talk, who trusted her mother to care for her. That trust was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Family members who had wanted to be part of Jalen's life were devastated to learn that she had died alone, While Candelario enjoyed a vacation she could have postponed, could have arranged childcare for, or could have brought Jalen along. The apartment where Jalen died has new tenants now, people who may not even know the tragedy that occurred there. But for the Cleveland police officers who responded to that scene, for the medical examiner who documented Jalen's suffering, for the prosecutors who built the case against Candelario, the memory remains vivid and painful. They've seen many difficult cases, but Jalen's death stands out for its preventability and for the utter callousness it represented. Crystal Candelario's life behind bars has only just begun. She has decades ahead of her to contemplate what she did. While she'll have regular meals, access to water, and a place to sleep, these are the very things she denied her daughter. The irony is not lost on those who prosecuted her. Candelario will receive care and sustenance that she refused to provide to her own child. In the years to come, Jalen's case will be studied in criminal justice courses, in child welfare training programs, and in discussions about parental responsibility. It stands as an extreme example of neglect resulting in death, a case study in how the failure to provide the most basic necessities of life, food, water, and supervision, can constitute murder when the victim is a helpless child dependent on their parent for survival. For those of us hearing this story, it's a reminder to speak up when something doesn't seem right. If you hear a child crying for extended periods, if you notice a pattern that concerns you, report it. A phone call to Child Protective Services could save a life. Jalen didn't have anyone to speak up for her, and she paid the ultimate price. If this case has affected you as deeply as it affected us, please show your support by liking this video. We're committed to telling these stories so that victims are remembered and so that awareness might prevent future tragedies. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Case 6. Sidney Powell, when a daughter's rage turned deadly. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Akron, Ohio, the Powell family appeared to live a comfortable, middle-class life. 50-year-old Brenda Powell was a devoted mother who worked hard to provide for her family. Her daughter, Sidney Powell, was a 19-year-old who lived at home while figuring out her future. To the outside world, they seemed like any other mother and daughter navigating the sometimes turbulent waters of young adulthood. But behind closed doors, tensions were building that would explode into horrific violence. On March 2020, neighbors heard disturbing sounds coming from the Powell home. Screaming, crashes, the unmistakable sounds of a violent struggle. When police arrived at the scene, they found a nightmare. Brenda Powell lay dead in her home, victim of a brutal attack. She had been stabbed repeatedly and beaten with such force that she had suffered massive trauma. The violence of the attack suggested rage, hatred, and a complete loss of control. Sidney Powell was found at the scene, covered in blood. She initially claimed that an intruder had broken in, that someone else was responsible for her mother's death. But investigators immediately had doubts. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. And the physical evidence told a very different story from the one Sidney was trying to sell. As detectives processed the scene, they found evidence of a prolonged struggle throughout the house. Blood evidence, defensive wounds on Brenda's body, and the pattern of injuries all painted a picture of a sustained attack. This wasn't a quick killing. This was a murder that had taken time, that had involved multiple acts of violence, that had required someone to continue attacking again and again even as their victim fought for her life. Under questioning, Sidney Powell's story began to fall apart. The inconsistencies piled up. Her explanation for the blood on her clothes didn't make sense. Her timeline of events didn't match the evidence. And ultimately, faced with overwhelming physical evidence, Sidney changed her story. She admitted that she had killed her mother, though she claimed it was in self-defense during an argument that had spiraled out of control. But the autopsy results and crime scene evidence contradicted the self-defense claim. The number and nature of Brenda's wounds indicated this was an attack, not a defensive struggle. She had been stabbed over 40 times. The beating had been severe enough to cause extensive blunt force trauma. This level of violence went far beyond what would be necessary to stop a threat, if indeed there had been a threat at all. As investigators dug into the background of the Powell family, they uncovered a more complicated picture than the one initially visible. Sidney and Brenda had a troubled relationship. Sidney had struggled with mental health issues and had been involved in conflicts with her mother about rules, responsibilities, and her future. Friends and family members described increasing tension in the household in the months leading up to the murder. On the day of the killing, according to the evidence and Sydney's later statements, an argument erupted between mother and daughter. The specifics of what triggered the fight remain disputed, but whatever started it, Sydney responded with lethal violence. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen and attacked her mother. When Brenda tried to defend herself, Sydney continued the assault. When the knife attack alone didn't accomplish her goal, Sydney escalated to beating her mother as well. The prosecution's theory, presented at trial, was that Sydney had been planning her mother's death, that the argument had been either a convenient excuse or perhaps even deliberately provoked. They pointed to evidence suggesting premeditation. Internet searches about killing, conversations Sydney had with friends where she expressed anger toward her mother, and the sheer brutality of the attack as evidence that this wasn't a momentary loss of control, but rather a deliberate act of murder. Sydney Powell was arrested and charged with murder. Her defense attorneys faced a difficult task. The evidence was overwhelming. Sydney had admitted to killing her mother. The forensics were damning. Their strategy focused on Sydney's mental state, arguing that she had been suffering from mental health issues that impaired her judgment, and that the killing had indeed been the result of a sudden loss of control rather than premeditated murder. The trial was emotionally charged, with family members divided. Some supported Sydney, believing that she had been driven to violence by circumstances beyond her control or by mental illness. Others were adamant that nothing justified what Sydney had done to Brenda, that she deserved to spend the rest of her life in prison for murdering her own mother. The jury heard testimony from mental health experts, from investigators, from family members, and from Sydney herself. They saw crime scene photos that were difficult to view, documenting the brutality of the attack. They heard the medical examiner describe each of Brenda's injuries in clinical detail. And they had to decide, was this murder or was this something less? The verdict came back, guilty of murder. The jury rejected the defense's arguments, finding that Sydney Powell had unlawfully and intentionally killed her mother. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. This meant that Sydney, who was 19 at the time of the murder, wouldn't be eligible for parole until she was in her mid-30s. However, the story didn't end with the initial conviction. Sydney Powell's case has been subject to ongoing appeals. Her defense team has argued various grounds for appeal, including issues with her representation at trial, questions about how her mental health was handled, and other procedural matters. As of the time of this recording, while her conviction initially stood, the case has gone through various legal challenges that have kept it in the appeals process. Brenda Powell's death devastated her family and community. She had been a dedicated mother, a hard worker, and someone who had tried to help her daughter navigate the challenges of young adulthood. She didn't deserve to die at the hands of the child she had raised and loved. Her other family members were left to mourn not just her loss, but also to grapple with the reality that one of their own had committed such a horrific act. The case raised important questions about family violence, mental health, and the challenges of parenting young adults who may be struggling. While nothing excuses or justifies what Sydney did, child welfare and mental health experts have pointed to the case as an example of how untreated mental health issues and family conflict can escalate to tragic outcomes. For the community of Akron, the Powell case was a reminder that violence can erupt in places we least expect it, in quiet suburban homes, between family members, in situations that from the outside appeared manageable. Neighbors who had heard occasional arguments from the Powell home now wondered if they should have intervened somehow, if there was something they could have done to prevent the tragedy. The legal complexities of Sydney Powell's case continue to unfold in the court system. Whether she will ultimately serve her full sentence, whether her conviction will stand through all appeals, and whether she'll eventually be released on parole remain questions for the future. What's certain is that Brenda Powell is gone, killed by her own daughter in an act of violence that shocked everyone who knew the family. Sydney Powell's age at the time of the crime, 19, put her case at an interesting intersection of juvenile and adult justice. She was legally an adult and was tried as one, but she was also barely out of her teenage years, an age when the brain is still developing and impulse control isn't fully mature. This didn't excuse her actions, but it did factor into discussions about appropriate sentencing. The psychological profile of children who kill their parents, known as parricide, has been studied extensively. These cases are relatively rare, but share some common factors. History of family conflict, mental health issues, substance abuse, in some cases, and a perceived lack of other options. Sydney's case fit some of these patterns, though every such case is unique in its specific circumstances. For those working in mental health and family counseling, the Powell case serves as a tragic reminder of the importance of early intervention when family conflicts escalate and when young people show signs of violent ideation. If Sydney had received more intensive mental health treatment, if the family conflict had been addressed through professional counseling, if there had been some intervention before the situation reached its breaking point, might Brenda still be alive? These are painful questions with no definitive answers, but they're important to ask if we hope to prevent future tragedies. Brenda Powell's memory lives on through those who loved her. Her family has worked to ensure she's remembered as more than just a murder victim. She was a person with dreams, with love for her children, with a life that had value and meaning beyond how it ended. The tragedy of her death is compounded by the fact that it came at the hands of someone she loved and had sacrificed so much for. If you've been moved by Brenda's story, if you believe in remembering victims and understanding the complex factors that lead to family violence, please like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing you in-depth coverage of important criminal cases. Case 7. Tamara Banks, Starvation and Neglect in Claremont County. In Claremont County, Ohio, in the year 2022, a 4-year-old girl died from malnutrition and neglect so severe that it shocked experienced child welfare workers and medical professionals. The little girl's mother, Tamara Banks, had systematically denied her daughter the most basic necessities of life: adequate food, clean water, medical care, and a safe environment. The child's death was slow, painful, and entirely preventable. The case came to light when emergency services were called to Banks's home for an unresponsive child. When paramedics arrived, they found a little girl who was severely malnourished, weighing far less than a healthy 4-year-old should weigh. Her body showed signs of prolonged neglect. She was dehydrated, dirty, and suffering from multiple health issues that had gone untreated. Despite the efforts of emergency medical personnel, the child could not be saved. The Claremont County Sheriff's Office launched an investigation that would reveal horrifying details about the conditions in which the child had been living. The home was in deplorable condition, lacking basic sanitation and safe living conditions. There was evidence that the child had been denied adequate food for an extended period. Medical experts would later testify that the level of malnutrition the child suffered didn't happen overnight. It was the result of prolonged, systematic neglect. As investigators interviewed neighbors, family members, and others who had contact with the Banks family, a picture emerged of a mother who was either unable or unwilling to care for her daughter properly. Some witnesses reported that they had concerns about the child's welfare, but hadn't known how severe the situation was. Others admitted they had seen warning signs but hadn't reported them to authorities, a decision they would come to regret deeply. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the child's suffering. She had been severely malnourished, with her body weight far below what it should have been for her age. She showed signs of vitamin deficiencies and other health problems related to poor nutrition. There was evidence of prolonged dehydration. The medical examiner concluded that the child had essentially starved to death while in her mother's care. Tamara Banks was arrested and charged with a series of felonies related to her daughter's death. The charges included involuntary manslaughter, child endangering, and other offenses. Prosecutors argued that Banks had willfully and deliberately withheld adequate food and care from her daughter, and that this neglect had directly resulted in the child's death. The question that haunted everyone was why. Why would a mother allow her child to starve? Investigators looked into Banks's background, examining her financial situation, her mental health, her access to resources, and her history with Child Protective Services. What they found was a complex picture that included possible mental health issues, substance abuse problems, and a pattern of poor decision-making. However, prosecutors made clear that regardless of Banks's personal struggles, she had a fundamental responsibility to feed and care for her daughter. There were resources available, food banks, social services, government assistance programs, that could have provided help. Instead, Banks had isolated herself and her daughter, rejecting offers of help and hiding the extent of the neglect until it was too late. The case went through the court system, with Banks ultimately accepting a plea deal rather than face a jury trial. In 2022, she pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and related charges. The plea agreement took the death penalty off the table, but still resulted in a significant prison sentence. Banks was sentenced to a term of 9 to 13.5 years in prison, meaning she would serve at minimum 9 years before being eligible for release. For many who followed the case, the sentence seemed insufficient given the severity of the child's suffering. A little girl had starved to death slowly over an extended period, and her mother would potentially be released while still relatively young. However, prosecutors explained that the plea deal ensured a conviction without the risks of a trial, and that Banks would be a registered child offender upon release, subject to restrictions and monitoring. The child's death sparked discussions in Claremont County about how to better identify and intervene in cases of severe neglect. Child welfare agencies reviewed their procedures, looking for ways to improve home visits, follow up on concerns, and coordination between different agencies that might interact with at-risk families. The tragic reality was that this child had been invisible to the systems meant to protect her until it was too late. Mandatory reporters, teachers, doctors, social workers, and others who work with children received additional training on recognizing signs of malnutrition and severe neglect. The warning signs are often visible. A child who is significantly underweight, who appears constantly hungry, who has poor hygiene, who seems developmentally delayed, or who is frequently absent from school or medical appointments. But recognizing these signs only matters if people act on them by reporting to Child Protective Services. The case also highlighted the challenges of addressing neglect cases before they become fatal. Child Protective Services across Ohio are often overwhelmed with cases, understaffed, and forced to make difficult decisions about which situations require immediate intervention. While no one is saying the system failed in this case, without full information, the death of a child from starvation raises inevitable questions about whether more could have been done. For the extended family members who had been denied access to the child or who didn't realize how severe the situation was, the guilt and grief were overwhelming. They wished they had pushed harder to see the little girl, had been more insistent about offering help, had reported their concerns to authorities sooner. Their regrets can't bring the child back, but their advocacy has helped push for reforms to prevent similar tragedies. Tamara Banks is currently serving her sentence in the Ohio prison system. She has several years remaining before she'll be eligible for parole. When that time comes, the parole board will have to weigh many factors: her behavior in prison, her participation in rehabilitation programs, her mental health treatment, and most importantly, whether she can ever be trusted around children again. The likelihood is that even if released, she'll face severe restrictions regarding contact with minors. The 4-year-old victim in this case deserves to be remembered as more than just a statistic, more than just another child who fell through the cracks. She was a little girl who should have been learning, playing, and growing. She should have been starting school, making friends, experiencing the world with wonder and joy. Instead, her short life was marked by hunger, neglect, and ultimately, impreventable death. Child neglect cases don't always make headlines the way more dramatic crimes do, but they're every bit as serious. A child who is systematically denied food and care suffers tremendously, both physically and emotionally. The psychological impact of neglect can be as damaging as physical abuse, leaving children with trauma that affects them for life, if they survive. The Claremont County case serves as a reminder that poverty alone doesn't cause child neglect. There are many parents who struggle financially, but who prioritize feeding their children, who seek out resources, who ensure their kids' basic needs are met even when it's difficult. Banks had options available to her. She chose not to use them. That's what made her actions criminal rather than simply unfortunate. Community members who knew about the case have reported being more vigilant about the welfare of children in their neighborhoods. They've learned that it's better to make a call to Child Protective Services and be wrong than to stay silent and have something terrible happen. While false reports can be problematic, genuine concern for a child's welfare should always be reported to proper authorities who can investigate. The lasting legacy of this case in Claremont County has been increased awareness and, hopefully, increased willingness to speak up when something doesn't seem right. If more people had reported concerns earlier, if someone had pushed harder to check on the child's welfare, might she still be alive? These questions haunt everyone connected to the case. If this story has impacted you, if you believe in protecting children and holding neglectful parents accountable, please like this video. We cover these difficult cases to raise awareness and honor victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Case 8. Tien Lynn Hawkins, a mother charged with the unthinkable. In Adams County, Ohio, in the summer of 2025, a case emerged that sent shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community. Tien Lynn Hawkins, a mother of multiple children, was indicted on charges of murder, involuntary manslaughter, child abuse, and child endangerment after her 2-year-old daughter died from asphyxiation. The circumstances surrounding the child's death raised immediate red flags for investigators and revealed a pattern of abuse that had apparently been ongoing. The case began when emergency services were called to Hawkins's home for a report of an unresponsive toddler. When first responders arrived, they found a 2-year-old girl who was not breathing. Despite their efforts to perform life-saving measures, the child was pronounced dead. The initial cause of death appeared to be asphyxiation, but the circumstances were suspicious from the start. The Adams County Sheriff's Office launched an investigation that would uncover disturbing details about the conditions in the Hawkins home and the treatment of the children living there. Medical examinations of Hawkins's other children revealed signs of abuse and neglect. The children showed evidence of malnutrition, poor hygiene, and injuries consistent with physical abuse. Child Protective Services immediately removed the surviving children from the home, placing them in protective custody while the investigation continued. As detectives interviewed witnesses and examined evidence, a picture emerged of a household where children were subjected to abuse and where the 2-year-old's death may not have been an isolated incident, but rather the tragic culmination of ongoing mistreatment. Neighbors reported hearing children crying frequently from the Hawkins residence, but many had attributed it to normal childhood distress rather than signs of serious abuse. The medical examiner's findings were crucial to building the case against Hawkins. The autopsy revealed that the 2-year-old had died from asphyxiation, but there were also other injuries present that suggested the child had been subjected to abuse over time. The forensic evidence indicated that the asphyxiation was not accidental. The circumstances strongly suggested it was the result of deliberate action or gross negligence rising to the level of criminal conduct. In July of 2025, a grand jury in Adams County heard evidence presented by prosecutors and returned indictments against Tien Lynn Hawkins on multiple serious charges. She was charged with murder in the death of her 2-year-old daughter, as well as involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment, and multiple counts of child abuse related to the treatment of her other children. The charges reflected the severity of what prosecutors alleged had happened in the Hawkins home. The murder charge indicated that prosecutors believed Hawkins had purposely caused her daughter's death. The involuntary manslaughter charge provided an alternative theory that even if she hadn't intended to kill the child, her actions were reckless and showed such disregard for human life that they constituted a serious crime. The child abuse and endangerment charges related to the condition and treatment of the surviving children. Hawkins was arrested and held in the Adams County Jail on a substantial bond. The community was shocked by the allegations. Adams County is a rural area where neighbors often know each other, where families have lived for generations, and where such horrific crimes seem incongruous with the quiet, pastoral setting. Yet behind the doors of one home, children had allegedly been suffering while the community went about its daily life. As the case moved through the judicial system, more details emerged during pretrial hearings. Prosecutors presented evidence about the conditions in which the children had been living, the medical findings about the 2-year-old's death, and the statements made by witnesses and the other children. The defense indicated they would challenge the prosecution's theory of the case, though specific defense strategies were not fully revealed in the early stages of proceedings. The case against Tien Lynn Hawkins is notable because it represents not just the death of one child, but allegations of systematic abuse of multiple children. Child welfare experts explain that in such cases, the home environment has typically become deeply dysfunctional over time, with abuse escalating and the parent or parents becoming increasingly isolated from support systems and oversight. For the surviving children removed from Hawkins's care, the trauma will be long-lasting. They've lost their sister, been removed from their mother, and will have to process the abuse they allegedly endured. These children will require extensive therapy stable foster or adoptive homes, and years of support to help them heal from their experiences. The psychological damage from severe child abuse can persist into adulthood, affecting everything from relationships to educational achievement to mental health. The 2-year-old victim in this case was at an age where she should have been exploring the world, learning to talk in sentences, playing with toys, and forming attachments. Instead, according to the indictments, she was living in an environment of abuse that ultimately cost her life. The specific circumstances of her asphyxiation have not been fully disclosed publicly, as the case is still in the pretrial phase, but the charges indicate prosecutors believe they have strong evidence of culpability. Adams County, like many rural areas, faces challenges in terms of child welfare oversight. With a smaller population spread across a larger geographic area, it can be harder for social services to conduct regular check-ins, and for neighbors to notice warning signs when families are more isolated from each other. The Hawkins case has prompted discussions in the county about how to improve child protection given these unique challenges. Schools play a crucial role in identifying abused and neglected children, as teachers and staff see children regularly and can notice changes in behavior, appearance, or attendance. However, very young children like Hawkins's 2-year-old may not yet be in preschool or daycare, making them even more vulnerable if they're not being taken for regular medical checkups where doctors might notice concerns. The indictment of T.N. Lynn Hawkins is just the beginning of what will likely be a lengthy legal process. She faces the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison if convicted on the murder charge. Even if convicted on lesser charges, the sentences could still amount to decades behind bars. The trial, when it occurs, will require the jury to hear difficult evidence about child abuse and death, and to make determinations about Hawkins's culpability. For the Adams County community, the case has been a painful reminder that child abuse can happen anywhere, in any type of family, in any socioeconomic context. The stereotype of child abusers as obviously troubled or marginal individuals is often wrong. Abuse happens in homes that from the outside appear normal, perpetrated by parents who in public may seem fine, but behind closed doors are harming their children. The prosecution of T.N. Lynn Hawkins is ongoing as of this recording. The case has not yet gone to trial, and she maintains the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. However, the indictments based on grand jury review of evidence indicate that prosecutors believe they have a strong case. The legal proceedings will unfold over the coming months, with pretrial motions, potentially a trial, and ultimately, if there's a conviction, sentencing. For those who believe in justice for child victims, who want to see children protected and abusers held accountable, cases like this one are both heartbreaking and important to follow. They remind us of the vulnerability of children and the sacred responsibility of parents to protect rather than harm their offspring. They also highlight the crucial role of community members in reporting concerns and of systems in responding effectively to those reports. If you're following this case and want to stay informed about its outcome, please like this video. We'll continue to bring you updates on significant criminal cases, always with respect for victims and commitment to factual reporting. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss important updates. Case 9. Dacia Summers, justice delayed but not denied. In Hocking County, Ohio, a case that began as a tragic infant death in 2022 took a dramatic turn in late 2025 when prosecutors finally filed murder charges. Dacia Summers, a 27-year-old mother, was formally charged with murder and other serious felonies in connection with the death of her 10-month-old daughter, Camilla, who had died 3 years earlier under suspicious circumstances. The original incident occurred in 2022 when Camilla was brought to a hospital with severe injuries. The baby had suffered catastrophic head trauma and had extensive injuries across her small body. Summers initially claimed that the injuries were the result of an accident, perhaps a fall or some other mishap that had occurred while she was caring for her daughter. Medical personnel were immediately skeptical of this explanation. Doctors who examined Camilla found that her injuries were not consistent with the explanation Summers had provided. The pattern of injuries, their severity, and the medical evidence all suggested that this was not an accident, but rather the result of abusive trauma. Pediatric specialists who deal with child abuse cases were consulted, and their expert opinions supported the conclusion that Kamila had been the victim of inflicted injuries, not accidental ones. Despite the best efforts of medical professionals, Kamila's injuries were too severe. The 10-month-old baby died as a result of her head trauma. The case was immediately flagged as a suspicious death, and the Hocking County Sheriff's Office launched a homicide investigation. However, building a case strong enough to charge and convict someone of murder takes time, particularly when dealing with complex medical evidence and a young victim who couldn't tell investigators what happened. For 3 years, the case remained open but without charges being filed. Investigators continued to gather evidence, consult with medical experts, interview witnesses, and build a comprehensive case. During this time, Dacia Summers was living her life, aware that she was under investigation but not yet facing criminal charges. For Kamila's family members who believed Summers was responsible, this period was frustrating and painful. They wanted justice for the baby, but the legal system moves slowly, especially in complex cases. In December of 2025, the wait ended. The Hocking County Prosecutor's Office announced that Dacia Summers had been formally indicted on multiple charges, including murder, in connection with Kamila's death. The indictment indicated that prosecutors now felt they had sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Summers had caused her daughter's fatal injuries and that these actions constituted murder. The specific charges against Summers include murder, felonious assault, child endangerment, and other related offenses. The murder charge is the most serious, carrying a potential sentence of life in prison. The felonious assault charge relates to the actual infliction of the injuries that killed Kamila. The child endangerment charges encompass the broader context of placing a child in a situation where their health and safety were at risk. According to court documents and statements from prosecutors, the evidence in the case includes medical expert testimony about the nature and cause of Kamila's injuries, forensic evidence from the scene and from the hospital examination, witness statements, and inconsistencies in Summers' own statements about what happened. The prosecution's theory is that Summers inflicted fatal head trauma on her daughter, likely through shaking, striking, or some other violent action, and then provided false information to medical personnel and law enforcement about how the injuries occurred. The defense will likely argue that the injuries could have been caused by something other than intentional abuse, that perhaps there was an accident that Summers didn't witness or doesn't fully remember, or that someone else might have been responsible. They may also challenge the medical testimony, bringing in their own experts to offer alternative explanations for Kamila's injuries. These are common defense strategies in cases involving infant and child deaths where the medical evidence is central to proving the prosecution's case. Kamila was just 10 months old when she died. A baby who was probably just learning to crawl or perhaps take her first steps, who was babbling and starting to develop her personality, who was entirely dependent on her mother for care and protection. Instead of receiving that care, she suffered injuries so severe that they cost her her life. The betrayal inherent in a parent harming their own infant is difficult for most people to comprehend. Cases involving the death of infants are particularly challenging for several reasons. The victims can't tell investigators what happened. The injuries may be internal and not immediately obvious. Parents or caregivers often have exclusive access to the child, meaning there are no independent witnesses. And differentiating between accidental injuries and inflicted trauma requires sophisticated medical analysis that can be time-consuming and expensive. The medical term for what Kamila allegedly suffered is abusive head trauma, formerly known as shaken baby syndrome. This occurs when an infant or young child is violently shaken or struck, causing the brain to move within the skull and resulting in bleeding, swelling, and damage. The injuries are often fatal or cause permanent disabilities in survivors. Despite parents' claims that they only shook the baby a little to wake them up or stop them from crying, medical evidence shows that the force required to cause these injuries is substantial, and the person inflicting them would know they were being violent. The 3-year gap between Kamila's death and the filing of charges is not unusual in complex homicide cases, particularly those involving children. Prosecutors want to be certain they have a strong case before proceeding to trial, as they typically only get one chance to prosecute. Double jeopardy protections mean that if Summers were charged, tried, and acquitted, she generally couldn't be tried again even if new evidence emerged. Therefore, prosecutors waited until they were confident in their case. For Kamila's family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and others who loved her, the filing of charges brought mixed emotions. On one hand, there was relief that Summers would finally face justice, that the legal system had not forgotten Kamila. On the other hand, no criminal prosecution can bring Kamila back or undo the suffering she endured. The trial, when it occurs, will require family members to relive the trauma of Kamila's death, to hear difficult medical testimony, and to face the person they believe killed their beloved baby. Daisha Summers was arrested following the indictment and is being held pending trial. She has entered a plea of not guilty to all charges, as is her right. The case will now proceed through pretrial motions, discovery, and eventually either a plea deal or a trial. Given the severity of the charges, particularly the murder charge, prosecutors are unlikely to offer a lenient plea deal. Summers faces the real possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison if convicted. The Hocking County community has followed this case closely since Kamila's death in 2022. Many residents were frustrated by what seemed like a lack of progress, not understanding that behind the scenes, investigators and prosecutors were methodically building their case. Now that charges have been filed, there's a sense that justice is moving forward, though the outcome remains uncertain pending trial. Child abuse pediatricians who work on cases like Kamila's perform heartbreaking work. They examine injured and deceased children, document their findings, testify in court, and live with the knowledge of the suffering these young victims endured. Their expertise is crucial in child abuse prosecutions, as they can explain to juries how they distinguish between accidental and inflicted injuries, why certain injury patterns are diagnostic of abuse, and why alternative explanations don't fit the medical evidence. For anyone who has worked with infants, as a parent, teacher, healthcare provider, or caregiver, the idea of intentionally harming a baby is almost incomprehensible. Infants are helpless, completely dependent on adults for every need. They cry not to be manipulative, but because it's their only way to communicate discomfort, hunger, fear, or pain. An adult's response to infant crying should be to address the need, not to respond with violence. The Kamila Summers case is a reminder that justice can take time, but that dedicated investigators and prosecutors don't give up on victims. 3 years after her death, Kamila's case was moved forward with serious criminal charges against her mother. The legal process will now run its course, with both the prosecution and defense presenting their cases and a jury ultimately deciding Daisha Summers' guilt or innocence. As this case proceeds toward trial, updates will be reported in local media and court records. For those interested in following the case to its conclusion, staying informed through reliable news sources and court documents is important. The outcome will determine whether Daisha Summers spends decades or life in prison, or whether she is acquitted and freed. If you believe in justice for infant victims like Kamila, if you support the work of investigators and prosecutors who pursue these difficult cases, please show your support by liking this video. We'll continue to bring you updates on this and other important criminal cases. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Case 10. Timika Eggleton, a young life ended outside a Cleveland store. In June of 2023, shoppers at a Cleveland store witnessed something that no one should ever have to see. Outside the establishment, they found a 3-year-old boy named Curtis Witcher in a stroller, unresponsive and clearly in distress. The child's mother, 31-year-old Timika Eggleton, was with the boy, but it quickly became apparent that something was terribly wrong. Emergency services were called immediately, and paramedics rushed to the scene. When they examined Curtis, they found a little boy with severe injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. Despite their efforts to save him, Curtis Witcher was transported to a local hospital where he was pronounced dead. The Cleveland Police Department immediately launched a homicide investigation, and their focus quickly centered on the boy's mother. As investigators began piecing together what had happened, a horrific story emerged. According to the evidence and witness statements, Timika Eggleton had brutally beaten her 3-year-old son. The attack had been severe and sustained, inflicting injuries across Curtis's small body. The medical examiner would later determine that the cause of death was blunt force trauma. The little boy had been beaten so badly that his injuries proved fatal. The question that haunted everyone who learned about the case was straightforward but agonizing. How could a mother do this to her own 3-year-old child? What could possibly drive someone to beat a toddler to death? As detectives investigated Eggleton's background and the circumstances leading up to Curtis's death, they found a troubled picture involving possible substance abuse, mental health issues, and a pattern of behavior that suggested Curtis may have been abused before the fatal incident. Witnesses who had seen Eggleton and Curtis in the days and weeks before his death reported concerning interactions. Some said they had seen Eggleton handling Curtis roughly, yelling at him, or treating him in ways that made them uncomfortable. However, as is tragically common in child abuse cases, these concerns had not been reported to Child Protective Services or law enforcement until it was too late. The autopsy results were devastating to review. Curtis had extensive injuries consistent with repeated blows. He had bruising in various stages of healing, indicating that this was not the first time he had been subjected to violence. The pathologist documented injury after injury, painting a picture of a child who had suffered tremendously before his death. The medical examiner's conclusion was unequivocal. Curtis Witcher had been the victim of child abuse that resulted in his death. Timika Eggleton was arrested and charged with murder, felonious assault, and child endangerment. The charges reflected the severity of what she had allegedly done to her son. The murder charge indicated that prosecutors believed she had purposely caused Curtis's death. The felonious assault charge related to the actual beating that killed him, and the child endangerment charges encompassed the broader pattern of putting Curtis in situations where his safety and life were at risk. The evidence against Eggleton was substantial. There was the medical evidence from Curtis's body documenting the abuse. There were witness statements from people who had seen Eggleton with Curtis. There were statements Eggleton herself had made to law enforcement, which contained inconsistencies and indications of guilt. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, Eggleton's attorneys likely advised her that going to trial would be extremely risky. In the summer of 2023, Timika Eggleton made the decision to accept responsibility for her actions. She pleaded guilty to murder, felonious assault, and child endangering charges. By pleading guilty, she acknowledged that she had killed her son and that she was responsible for his suffering and death. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no drawn-out legal battle, no forcing of Curtis's other family members to sit through a painful trial. The sentencing hearing was emotional and difficult. Curtis's family members, his father, grandparents, and other relatives, had the opportunity to address the court and to speak about who Curtis was and what his loss meant to them. They described a bright, loving little boy who deserved so much better than the short, painful life he had. They talked about his smile, his laugh, the way he played, and the future he would never have. And they confronted Eggleton with the magnitude of what she had done. The prosecution presented evidence and arguments about why Eggleton deserved the maximum sentence possible. They emphasized the vulnerability of the victim, a 3-year-old child entirely dependent on his mother for care and protection. They highlighted the brutality of the beating that killed Curtis. They pointed to evidence of prior abuse, indicating this was part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident. And they argued that Eggleton posed a danger to any children she might have contact with in the future. The judge, in handing down the sentence, spoke about the sacred trust between parent and child that Eggleton had violated in the worst possible way. He described the crime as one of the most horrific he had encountered in his years on the bench. He noted that Curtis had been defenseless, that he had looked to his mother for love and protection and received violence instead. The judge made clear that Eggleton's actions warranted the most serious punishment available under law. Timika Eggleton was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole only after serving between 31 and 35 years. This means that Eggleton, who was 31 years old at the time of sentencing, will be in her 60s before she's even eligible to appear before a parole board. And eligibility doesn't mean release. The parole board will have to determine if she should ever be freed, considering the nature of her crime and whether she poses a risk to public safety. For Curtis Witcher's family, no sentence could bring him back or undo his suffering. They supported the life sentence, believing that Eggleton should never be free to harm another child. But they also spoke about the difficulty of moving forward, of trying to remember Curtis for the joy he brought to their lives rather than focusing solely on how his life ended. They established a memorial for Curtis and have worked to keep his memory alive. The The Cleveland community where Curtis died was shocked by the brutality of his murder. The fact that he was found outside a store, in a public place, in a stroller, it all seemed surreal. People wondered how a mother could beat her child to death and then casually push him in a stroller. What kind of person does that? The psychological profile of parents who kill their children has been studied extensively, but each case is unique in its specific circumstances and motivations. Child protection advocates have pointed to Curtis's case as an example of why community members need to report concerns about children's welfare. Those witnesses who saw Eggleton treating Curtis roughly in the days before his death. What if one of them had called Child Protective Services? Might Curtis have been removed from her care in time to save his life? These are painful hypotheticals, but they're important to consider if we want to prevent future tragedies. The Cleveland Police Department's investigation into Curtis's death was thorough and professional. Detectives worked quickly to build a case against Eggleton, ensuring that justice could be pursued. The Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office performed a detailed autopsy that documented Curtis's injuries and provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office pursued appropriate charges and secured a guilty plea and significant sentence. For the first responders who tried to save Curtis that day outside the store, the case has stayed with them. Paramedics and EMTs see many difficult situations, but cases involving the abuse and death of young children are particularly traumatic. Many departments now provide mental health support and counseling for first responders who deal with child abuse cases, recognizing the emotional toll of this work. Curtis Witcher was only 3 years old when his life was stolen from him by the person who should have protected him most. He never got to start school, never got to learn to ride a bike, never got to experience the many milestones of childhood. His potential was unlimited, but it was cut short by violence inflicted by his own mother. His memory serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of children and the importance of vigilance in protecting them. Timika Eggleton will spend decades in prison thinking about what she did. She'll have plenty of time to reflect on her actions, to grapple with the magnitude of taking her son's life. Whether she'll ever express genuine remorse, whether she'll take responsibility beyond her guilty plea, whether she'll use her time in prison to become a better person, these remain open questions. What's certain is that she'll never again have the opportunity to harm a child. The case has had lasting impacts on how child welfare is approached in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County. Training programs for social workers, law enforcement, and educators have incorporated lessons from Curtis's death. The goal is to identify at-risk children earlier, to intervene before abuse becomes fatal, and to ensure that children like Curtis don't fall through the cracks of the system. For anyone who has been moved by Curtis Witcher's story, who believes that children deserve protection and that those who harm them must face justice, this case represents both a tragedy and an example of the legal system working as it should. Eggleton was caught, charged, convicted, and sentenced to decades in prison. While this doesn't bring Curtis back, it does ensure that his killer will not walk free for a very long time. If you've been following this story, if you believe in remembering victims like Curtis Witcher, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Time. We're dedicated to covering important criminal cases with depth, respect, and commitment to the truth. Your support allows us to continue this work. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We've journeyed through 10 cases that represent some of the darkest moments in Ohio's criminal history. 10 mothers who betrayed the most fundamental bond that exists, the bond between mother and child. 10 children whose lives were stolen by the very people meant to protect them. These cases from across Ohio, spanning decades, remind us that evil can exist anywhere, can wear any face, and can hide behind the most trusted relationships. From China Arnold's unthinkable use of a microwave oven as a murder weapon, to Nicole Dyer's attempt to hide her crime with arson, to Gail Ritchie's abandonment of her newborn in the woods, to Ming Chen's fatal beating of her daughter, to Crystal Candelario's abandonment of her baby while she vacationed, to Sidney Powell's brutal attack on her own mother, to Tamara Banks's starvation of her child, to Tian Lynn Hawkins's alleged abuse leading to her toddler's asphyxiation, to Daisha Summers's indictment for her infant's death, and finally to Timika Eggleton's beating death of her 3-year-old son. Each case is a tragedy that reverberates through families and communities. These women will never see freedom again, or in most cases, not for decades. They're serving life sentences or sentences so lengthy that they'll be elderly before they're even eligible for parole. The justice system has spoken. Mothers who kill their children, who abuse them, who neglect them to death, will be held accountable. But beyond the legal consequences, these cases raise important questions for all of us. How do we better identify at-risk children? How do we support struggling parents before situations become desperate? How do we create communities where people look out for vulnerable children and aren't afraid to report concerns? How do we ensure that child protective services have the resources and authority to intervene when necessary? The victims in these cases, Paris Talley, Jacob Dyer, Giaga's Child, Ashley Zhao, Jalen Candelario, Brenda Powell, the 4-year-old daughter of Tamara Banks, the children of Tien Lynn Hawkins, Kamila, and Curtis Witcher, deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as individuals whose lives had value and meaning. They deserved better. They deserve to live. They deserve to grow up, to laugh, to learn, to experience all the joys of childhood and beyond. This has been Cold Case Time, and thank you for watching this difficult documentary. If you believe in justice for victims, in remembering those who can no longer speak for themselves, and in raising awareness about child abuse and maternal filicide, please like this video, share it with others who need to hear these stories, and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you're always updated when we release new content. Your support allows us to continue bringing you in-depth, thoroughly researched true crime documentaries. Remember, if you see something concerning regarding a child's welfare, say something. Report it to Child Protective Services or law enforcement. You might save a life. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and never forget the victims.